Good morning, everybody. Welcome to another in our series of Jadu Masterclasses. Today, we're going to be looking at some of the connections between Jadu Central and Jadu Connect, particularly in terms of how you can enable customers to update and transition cases without them having to go through the My Account sign up. So there's some tools that we can use to hopefully enable you to do that in a secure way. So one thing we get asked a lot is how you can enable customers to securely interact with a case in Connect if they don't have a My Account, or maybe they don't have direct visibility of the case for some reason. So there is a way that you can use what we call access codes to enable this securely. So one thing you don't want to do is literally just ask the customer to input their case reference in a form when you're asking them to update something, because if they slightly mistype their case reference, they could in theory end up updating someone else's case. So we use the notion of access codes so that a customer can effectively input their case reference and a unique access code, and you can use the system to then match those things up to validate that the case is going to update correctly. So I've created a very simple sort of open shut in progress type workflow that we can use to demo this. And I have created a couple of forms in relation to the workflow. We have one to generate the case, which has sort of the usual kind of fields for things like the person reference and address and some data. But I've also created a text field called access code that I've added. And then the second form is just a form with one sort of data field in that we can use to update the case via a transition. So what we want to do in this case is we want to be able to have the customer complete a form that will then raise a new case, but also that the customer can complete a secondary form and update that case without having to log into Connect. So if I go to the form that we've created to generate the case, I've got a very basic form here with some simple questions on it. Just sign back in. First name, last name, address, and then just a field to put some data in for the demo purpose. Now, what I want to do is when the user completes the form, as I said, I want it to generate a case in Jadu Connect, but I also want it to generate a unique access code. So we actually have a piece of logic that does that in Jadu Central. So if I go to logic and I select add a piece of logic, I'll call it access code. And then under predefined logic, if I search for access, we have a piece of predefined logic called generate access code. And what this does is it generates a random 9-character alphanumeric string that we can then use to validate in Connect. So what we want to do is generate an access code, pass that into the case along with the data that we're passing over. So I'm going to save that piece of logic. So if I go in and create my rule, so let's just call this create case. So when the user submits the form, I'm going to generate a customer record. So bit of preparation earlier, we've got a template here to generate the customer record. And then I'm going to generate the case itself. So I'm going to create case. I'll create a new template for this. Case type is my access code demo case. Oh, that's interesting. Let me just check something. Potentially user error when I set the form up. Yes, that's me. So I've not set an initial status. So that's why I'm getting that error. Let's change that. Okay, so let's try again. So I'm not going to run this as the signed in user because we don't want the customer to be able to access the case. I'm going to get my person reference from the previous create person action. So I'll just check the user value from a previous action field. My access code, I'm going to get from the piece of logic that I created. And then the address will be my address question. And I'm going to use the property identifier because I'm going to pass it into a formal address field in Connect. And then my data will just be my information field that I have put in the form. So nice, simple template. So I'll tell it to get the person reference from there. And let's just add a form completion message. So I'm just going to put the case reference in here. And I'm going to pop the access code in there as well so we can see that it's generated. So what I should be able to do now is complete this form as a customer. It will generate a case, and that case will then contain an access code that I can use for validation. The customer won't have access to the case, but they will still be able to update it based on the information that we're going to provide them with when they submit the form. So I'm going to jump into my form. So I'm not signed into an account or anything like that. So I'm just going to fill the form in. Let's just put something in there. When I submit that form, you can see that I've got my case reference and it's also generated a unique access code. So if I jump back to my administrator view, if I go into my case list as an internal administrator, you can see that my case has been generated. The access code's been passed through to the case. It's been linked to the new customer record. And I've got my data and the address logged against the case as well. So for the customer, we want them, as I said, to be able to update this case, but we want to ensure that they are going to update the correct case when they're filling a form in. As I said, if we just ask them to input their case reference, if they input number 2 instead of number 1, then they could potentially update someone else's case, which we obviously don't want. So we're going to use the access code to validate their registration. So I'm going to jump back to forms to show you how I'm going to set this up. So I'm going to create a new page template. Let's call it access details for now. And make it form specific. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to ask the customer for their case reference. And we need that. And I'm also going to ask the customer for their access code. And we'll make that required. Obviously, I could put some help text on here to say, you will find this in your confirmation email or however we're sending that to the user. And I'm going to add a text area for my updated information. What I also want to do now is I want to add some logic to the form. So if I just go in and create the initial structure of my form, let's just have my page in. What I want to do is add some logic to check the access code that's logged against the case reference the customer inputs in Connect, and then compare that with the access code that they've input in their form. So the first thing I'm going to do is add a piece of logic. Let's call it access code. Again, it's predefined logic, and we're going to use the logic that's connect value of a field for a specific case, because what we want to return is the access code field from the case in question. So we'll determine where the logic's going to get the case reference from, which will be the case reference question in the form. We'll get the access code field from Connect. And we're not going to run this as the signed in user because the signed in user doesn't have access to the case. So what this will do is it will look at the case reference the user has input, and it will return whatever the access code is in the background that's logged against that case. As my second piece of logic, we need to check the access code. So let's just call this check access code. Again, predefined logic. And we have a piece of logic called compare two values that allows you to compare two values, determine what your operator is, and then return a specified value if it's true or a specified value if it's false. So value A is going to be my access code logic. Doesn't really matter which way around they are in this example. And I want to check that it's equal to the access code that's been input by the customer in the field in the question. If that's true, we'll just return true. If it's false, we'll return false. So this will compare those two values and then return the relevant response based on the logic return. So jumping back to my form, what I could do is I could add a dead end branch in here. Let's put a message in invalid details. I'll say, please check your case reference and access code. And I'll save that. So I can now specify my branching criteria for going to the dead end, which will be a comparison of my check access code logic. If that returns equal to false, then we'll send the user to the dead end. So if the access codes don't match, we're going to send them down that route in the form. So, so let's add a template in here. So what we want to do is if they're successful, we're going to want to transition the case. So when the user submits the form, then we want to transition case, we'll create template. The case is the access code demo. The transition is we'll move it to in progress. And then in my template, we're going to get the case reference from the case reference question. We're not going to run it as the signed in user because, as I said, the user doesn't have access to the case in this instance. And then we'll get the new information details from the question in the form. So let's save that. Okay. So let's imagine that I've been emailed this as part of my confirmation, and I've got a link in there perhaps to my form for making an amendment to my case. So as a customer without access to the case and without having to sign in through the My account, I can go to the access code check form. Oh, let me just check I've published it. That helps. So I'll get my case reference. I'll input my access code. Let's change it so we know it's going to be wrong. Let's put the new information in here. So this then branches me to the invalid details page because the access code that I've input doesn't match the access code in the case that I'm trying to update. So it acts as a validation method. If I go back, let's put the correct access code in. I can then continue and submit my form. So if I then submit that form, if I go back to the case as an administrator, then this should have updated to in progress. And it's also updated the data field. So effectively, you can use those access codes as a method of validating a customer is going to update the correct case. And that then enables customers without my account or potentially a case where you're not exposing the case to the customer to be updated without risk of updating of someone else's case. So while we're here, I'm also going to just run through. We get a lot of questions about the different elements of Jadu Central logic and how they relate to Connect. So I'm going to just run through the different elements of logic that relate directly to pulling data from Jadu Connect, so we can talk about what each one does. So if I go into let's do it in this form. So I'm going to go back here. So if I go to logic, so under predefined logic, we have a number of standard pieces of logic that can pull data. So um, address of case. So this will literally look at the case and return whatever the address is from the address field. Um, so we can say we're going to get the case reference from the case reference question. We can decide the format. So do we want to just grab the UPRN or do we want to return the actual customer facing label? So let's do that. Let's call this address label. Again, we won't run it as the signed in user because the signed in user doesn't have access to the case in this example. So I'll do one for the label and I will do one for the UPRN as well. In this case, we'll just leave it set to UPRN only. I'm going to go through, set these logics up, and then we'll set some placeholders so you can see what they do. Can create a case for an address. So one of the things you can do in Connect when you're creating a case is you can specify a limit to the number of open cases that can be raised against a UPRN. So in this example, I've said one. So when you're filling out a form, if there's a limit in relation to the case that it's going to generate, what you want to do is you want to be able to determine whether you can raise that case or not. So that if they're already the maximum number of cases open, you can send the customer down the appropriate route through the form. So so we're going to select the access code demo case type. We're going to determine where we're getting the UPRN from. Let me put a question into my form to get the address. Yeah. So we're going to choose can create case for an address, access code demo. We're going to get the UPRN from the address lookup question. We won't run it as the signed in user. So if it can return a case, it will return true. If it can't, it will return false. So what this logic will do is it will look at the UPRN that's been input. It will look at the limit that's set up against the case, and it will then identify if there's any open cases already at the address. And then based on that value, determine whether a case can be created or not. You have logic that can pull back specific case dates. So I don't have any case dates associated with my form that I'm creating. But effectively, you can determine where you're getting the case reference from. Pop in the unique identifier for the case date. You can get those from within Connect. If you go to settings, communication, you can select one of your dates and you can copy the unique identifier. You can decide if you want to include the time and also whether you want to run it as the signed in user. That will literally then return that case date for you to be able to use it in the form in some way. We can check if the user is a member of an organization. So this relies on the my account element. So if you have a form that's a specific business form and you're using the organization accounts, when a user signs in to complete that form, you can check if they are actually a member of an organization or not. So if they're not a member of an organization, you could potentially then transfer them to a dead end page to say that it's a business form. Or if they are a member, then they can progress through the form. Reference for most recent case for user. Again, because we're not using user sign-in for this particular case, we'll set this up, but effectively what this does is it looks at who's signed in. So you have to be signed into a My account for this piece of logic to work. you effectively pick the case type that you want to look for. And this logic, if the user has raised a case of that type, it will return the most recent case reference um, for that user. Otherwise, it will just return none if the user's never raised that case. Status of a case. So literally does what it says. It will check against the case reference and it will return the status. So let's do this for the example. So again, we'll point it at the case reference. We won't run it as the signed in user because in this example, as I said, the signed in user can't see the case. And we'll save that. Oh, let's give it a title. Um, then the last one we've already looked at, which is the one that we use to pull back the access code, is value of a field for a specific case. You can literally use this to pull back any data from a case and pull it into a form. Um, so, maybe you've got a couple of linked cases and you need to be able to transfer data between the two of them in some way. Then you could use this logic to pull back the data from one case and then pass it into a new case. Or use it to update a separate case as part of a transition. So let's go to my pages and I'm just going to add, I've got a logic response sort of placeholder page here. So let's add in some placeholders for those bits of logic. So we'll add in the placeholder for the address label. Do the same for the UPRN. Grab the response for whether we can create a case or not. And the last one, we'll just grab that case status one as well. So I'm just dropping these in so you can see those logic responses when I fill the form in. So let's come back to here. So I'm going to use the same case reference and access code. Let's put an address search in. And I'll pick the same address that I used last time. So you can see here, it's returned the address label using that piece of logic. So this is being pulled from the case. It's returned the UPRN from the case. Because there's already a case raised and open against this address and this UPRN, it's telling me that it can't raise a new case against that because there's already one that's open and the limit is 1. And it's told me the status of the case that we input the reference for. If I go back, let's choose a different address. So in this case, obviously these remain the same because these are being pulled from the existing case. But in this instance, if we were looking to raise a new case, it's saying it can create a new case because there's no existing case against the address that we've just picked within the form. So thank you for all of your time today, and we'll hopefully see you all next month.